Hello everybody and welcome back. As always, I'm Mateo311 and this is your channel for everything VR related. Today, we're going over the best VR games of all time, separated by genre. This will include games from PCVR, PlayStation VR2, and the Meta Quest. Now this is the July 2024 edition, and I update this list roughly every 6 months. Now there are of course links and timestamps if you want to skip ahead, but as you move through this video, please let me know down in the comments which games you agree with, or if I missed any titles and genres. Now first up is a really easy category, and that's the story-driven single-player shooter. For nearly 5 years in a row now on PCVR, Half-Life Alyx still holds that title. Now I'm sure everyone knows what this game's about by now. Not only does it deliver stunning graphics, an excellent physics system, but it also has a lengthy campaign, excellent combat, and it takes place in one of the all-time greatest video game universes. Half-Life Alyx continues to be the measuring stick for best VR games, but I also want to give an honorable mention to Vertigo 2. Now this game has been self-described as a Half-like, and I always explain this title as Half-Life meets Rick and Morty. You could definitely see the inspiration of that classic shooter series, but it's also just a lot more zany with an excellent sense of humor. Now, not only is this an honorable mention for PCVR, but also my #1 recommendation for single-player shooter on the PlayStation VR2. Now, when it comes to the Meta Quest, it's a bit harder for me to pinpoint the best single-player story-driven shooter. Titles such as Resident Evil 4 and Into the Radius come to mind, but I'm going to be placing those under different genres. Instead, I'm going to go with a little bit of a controversial pick here and select Bone Lab for this category. For many, that overall campaign is love it or hate it, but regardless, it offers up something truly unique that you really can't get anywhere else. Now let me know down in the comments which category you fall into. Is Bone Lab just a janky tech demo, or is it currently one of the best shooters available on the Meta Quest? Now moving on into multiplayer PvP shooters, we have plenty of options to choose from. My personal favorite on PCVR, PlayStation VR2, and the Meta Quest is Pavlov and Pavlov Shack. But that's mainly because I gravitate more towards a Counter-Strike style shooter. It also offers up tons of different gameplay modes for whenever I start to get bored. But if you're not the biggest Counter-Strike fan, there's an equivalent to every style of flat screen shooter out there. For the Rainbow Six Siege fans, we have Breachers. It does an amazing job of capturing those same gameplay mechanics, and again, it's available for every single platform out there. Now, if you're a fan of extraction shooters like Escape from Tarkov, we have Ghosts of Tabor. This is an excellent combination of risk versus reward mechanics and realistic gun handling. It's currently only available for Quest and PCVR, but it is still planned to come to the PlayStation VR2. Now, unfortunately, the PlayStation VR2 doesn't have a Battle Royale title, but for everybody else, I highly recommend you check out Contractor Showdown. It has a huge map that's populated with up to 64 people, there's tons of realistic weapons, and awesome abilities that you could purchase in-game, and the studio's still planning some amazing updates. Now, there's a few other great options out there, but I'm actually going to slide them into other categories. Now, if you're not a fan of PvP and just prefer co-op, there's also plenty of great games currently available. My #1 go-to happens to be After the Fall, which is currently available on all major VR platforms. There's nothing like jumping into a game with 3 of your buddies, blasting down hordes of zombies, unlocking some new equipment, and rinse and repeat. Now, I would have preferred a bit more storyline, and definitely some more content when the game originally released, but overall it's some of the most fun I've had in VR co-op. Now, I do have some additional honorable mentions. First up is another zombie shooter, Arizona Sunshine 2. Not only can you play through the entire campaign with a buddy, but you could also just kill plenty of hours in their horde mode. Overall, the campaign does have some up and downs, but it's a lot of fun to play through. And finally, for the PlayStation VR2 owners who love high quality graphics, I recommend you jump into Crossfire Sierra Squad with some buddies. Overall, the single player campaign did disappoint me, but the game is a ton of fun when you bring some backup and just stop mowing down enemies. Now, if shooters aren't your style, there's also some excellent co-op RPGs out there. One of my personal favorite games on both PCVR and the PlayStation VR2 is Legendary Tales. You jump into a dark fantasy-themed world, and then have to battle through an array of different creatures, using both physics-based combat and an array of different magical spells. Character creation is extremely rewarding with a lot of different perks that allow you to specialize, and you can build everything from glass cannon mages to fist-striking monks and deadly archers. I found the overall gameplay loop extremely addicting, and this might even fill the void if you're looking for something like a VR MMO. Now, for Meta Quest owners, the go-to game is Dungeons of Eternity. In some ways, it's like a more cartoony and kid-friendly version of Legendary Tales, but it definitely stands on its own and offers up some unique gameplay elements. Ultimately, though, it's that same addictive gameplay loop. Grab some friends, jump in for some physics-based combat, level up, get some new skills and equipment, and then go battle some bigger and bigger enemies. What's not to love here, unless you just don't like RPGs? In that case, let's move on to some single-player action horror titles. There's one series that absolutely kicks ass in this category, and that is Resident Evil. MetaQuest owners absolutely have to give Resident Evil 4 a try. I was absolutely blown away by this game, and I honestly went in with some pretty low expectations because I didn't believe I would enjoy such an older title that I've already played so many times before. Well, I was definitely wrong, and VR made it so much better. PlayStation VR2 even ups the ante with a full modern remake of this game. There's significantly better audio and visuals, completely remade cutscenes, and some new mechanics specific to VR. But honestly, Resident Evil Village is an even better action horror experience. It's a pretty distinct departure from Resident Evil 7, which had a high emphasis on environmental storytelling, and RE8 just leans a lot more into the action. So prepare to battle some werewolf and vampire-style creatures, while still getting a nice chill down your spine. And speaking of chills down your spine, the Saints and Sinners series is a great option on all platforms, but probably the go-to action horror game for PCVR. It gives you just about everything you could want. Excellent graphics, fantastic physics-based combat, a compelling storyline with decisions that actually matter. But since we mentioned physics-based combat, it's time to get into some games that truly shine in VR, and that's the arena combat titles. The obvious go-to game for both Quest owners and PCVR players is Blade and Sorcery. This game spent 5 years in early access, both refining the combat and adding new features. Almost nothing else out there in VR offers up combat this good, and the final update that recently dropped basically gives you a full progression system and something similar to a single-player campaign. This is a staple VR title that everyone should own, unless of course you only own a PlayStation VR2 where it's not an option, and in that case I recommend Swordsman VR. It's not quite Blade and Sorcery, but it definitely stands on its own and offers up some unique features. Not only will you be battling warriors from different time periods and regions, including everything from knights to pirates, but the game does also offer a full progression system, and there's a bunch of fantasy-themed elements such as enemies and magical abilities. So on PlayStation VR2, it's your go-to combat game, and it's still an excellent option on other VR platforms. Now, if you need more than just an arena fighter and you're looking for a classic single-player RPG, there's not a lot of options out there, but everyone should give Asgard's Wrath a try. The original Asgard's Wrath is only on PCVR, and it offers up a 50-hour single-player campaign, some truly stunning graphics, excellent combat, challenging puzzles, and above all else, it knew how to deliver high-quality storytelling while using VR to its maximum potential. Now, Asgard's Wrath 2 is only available on the MetaQuest, and it outshines the original game in every single way except for those graphics. The combat and puzzles are significantly improved, the single-player campaign is not only better, but also much longer, and finally, there's this new roguelike mode that is just absolutely addictive. Not only is Asgard's Wrath 2 my favorite VR RPG, it's also one of my favorite all-time VR games. Now, unfortunately, there's not many great options on the PlayStation VR 2. If you're dying for an RPG, I would once again go with Legendary Tales, but I have to say that game is just much better in co-op. And finally, I have to give an honorable mention to Skyrim VR, after you've added about 200 mods to it. It's a pretty insane RPG experience that's unmatched by anything else, and once you mod those flat screen routes out of it, it becomes a truly solid title. Now our next category sticks with single-player games, but they focus on a story-driven experience. For PCVR, my undisputed winner is the Lone Echo series. I've never been so invested in a VR game storyline, and besides the slow start to the games, I love every single aspect. There's some stunning graphics that make this world extremely immersive. Out of nowhere, the storyline kicks into overdrive and keeps you guessing what will happen next, and the game is filled with some truly cinematic moments. It's a shame that only PCVR gamers got to experience this, and it's even worse that they're not continuing the series. Now, not many games for the MetaQuest or PlayStation VR 2 have intrigued me to the point of Lone Echo, but I definitely did get into Journey to Foundation. This game takes place in the lore-rich world of Isaac Asimov's epic novels. A Roman-style empire has been ruling the galaxy for thousands of years, is slowly beginning to collapse, and destined to throw the whole world back into the Dark Ages. The Foundation was formed to prevent this from happening, and it'll be up to you to choose your side in the imminent battle. Luckily, you not only have an array of sci-fi weapons at your disposal, but also some psychic abilities. So if your main focus is storyline, go check out Journey to Foundation. But if you prefer a puzzle game, the clear go-to on all platforms is Red Matter 2. This game basically has it all, including stunning graphics, a truly intriguing storyline, a nice little bit of combat, and of course some head-scratching puzzles. If you've never played the original, that's okay, this one stands on its own, and the second game was also designed to have more of a mainstream appeal anyway. Now I also need to give an honorable mention to Wanderer. This is basically an epic time-traveling adventure filled with tons of challenging puzzles. Now, as good as this game currently is, I don't recommend you run out and get it just yet, because their updated version, Fragments of Fate, is scheduled to release later this year and is coming to all VR platforms. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't mention Moss, and that's because I'm placing it in our next genre, the VR platformer. Believe it or not, Moss is one of my favorite all-time VR games. I'm honestly not a big platformer fan, and I never believed that controlling a mouse protagonist would appeal to a mature gamer like myself. Well, I was absolutely dead wrong, and I felt like best buddies with Quill by the end of the game, which also features a cute emotional story, absolutely fantastic graphics, and of course, great platforming mechanics. Now, if you want less combat and more jumping in your platformer, another easy recommendation is Max Mustard. It's your traditional colorful world to explore, but they also introduce a lot of cool new mechanics, and even some unlockable upgrades from Max himself. So if you're looking for something closer to Astrobot or Mario, Max Mustard is your go-to platformer. Now, if you happen to be a fan of roguelikes, I have good news because VR is full of them. Now, similar to what I did with PvP shooters, I'm actually going to name a bunch here and you just pick the ones that are right for you. An absolute classic is the retro shooter Compound. It's currently available on Quest and PCVR, with a PlayStation VR2 release coming in the future. If you're a fan of boomer shooters and high replayability, this is your go-to roguelike. But if you're looking for more strategy and physicality, I absolutely recommend Until You Fall. You'll be dropped into a super stylized, neon-themed world where you battle through an array of creatures, utilizing block and counter combat mechanics that I've never seen in another VR game. There's also plenty of weapons and power-ups to unlock over time, and this classic title still remains one of my favorite VR games. But if that style of combat isn't for you and you want something that's physics-based, you gotta jump into Underdogs. This takes place in a dystopian, futuristic version of the UK, where people compete in massive underground fighting arenas, utilizing some guerrilla-style mechs. The combat is absolutely fantastic, this game is dripping with style, and there's plenty of risk versus reward mechanics. Now, if you're not looking to break a sweat, another absolutely fantastic and highly addictive roguelike is Go Signal, a Stellaris game. This title puts strategic combat at the forefront, and not only gives you a cool storyline, tons of upgrades and replayability, but also some epic boss fights and a highly addictive gameplay loop. It's also fantastic if you're not a fan of physically active titles, as you could just sit back and play this game for hours on end. I pumped 4 straight hours into this game the second I got it, and I continued to play it for an hour plus every single day for the next month or so. Now, it might not look like much in the flat screen trailer, but trust me, don't sleep on this game. And finally, for PlayStation VR2 owners, I have to mention Synapse. This is an absolutely amazing first-person shooter with mechanics that make you end up feeling like a Sith Lord. After a bunch of rounds, you'll be telepathically throwing enemies around, conveniently exploding barrels for maximum damage, or just taking down enemies the good old-fashioned way with a handful of bullets. The overall storyline takes place in this cool Inception-style world, where your surroundings are actually a manifestation of you invading someone else's mind. This is easily one of my favorite all-time PlayStation VR2 games, and I just loved building up more and more power over time. But roguelites definitely aren't for everyone, so let's move on to the rhythm genre. The obvious no-brainer that's available on all platforms is Beat Saber. It's been over 6 years since this title initially released, and it's still one of the most popular VR games played today. Who knew that slicing boxes to the beat of music could be so much fun and also so challenging? This is the type of game where you could just chill out and enjoy some music, or crank up the game to a Souls-like difficulty. Now, if you think that's an exaggeration, some of these songs could take hundreds of hours to master on Expert Plus. Now, if you want a little bit more action in your rhythm games, the obvious choice is Pistol Whip. Not only does this game make you feel like John Wick, but you could also jump into multiple other scenes that vary all the way from cowboy to sci-fi hero. Pistol Whip's another one of those games that's been around for years now and just keeps getting better and better over time. But not everyone's a fan of rhythm games, so let's move on to another niche genre. Some people get into VR exclusively for Sims, and if that's you, something like Microsoft Flight Simulator 2023 is absolutely amazing. The game is basically as real as it gets, with multiple different planes to fly and tons of real-world locations to explore. But if you need more action in your sim, I highly recommend VTOL. Unlike Microsoft Flight Sim, VTOL puts you in the cockpit of fully loaded military vehicles. It'll train you on everything from the basics like takeoff and landing, all the way to aerial combat. There's also a ton of content, plus plenty of player-created material available on Valve's workshop. Now on the MetaQuest, it's a bit hard to pick a sim title, but probably the best experience is the Warplane games. You can experience both classic World War I dogfights, or jump into some modern aircrafts with Warplane's Air Corps. Now when we mention sims, we usually think flight games, but the PlayStation VR2 is lacking in that department. It does, however, have one of the most realistic driving experiences I've ever tried. Gran Turismo 7 is an all-around fantastic game, even if you're not into racing titles. The graphics are stunning, there's a massive campaign with tons of cars to unlock and customize, and it absolutely nails the exhilaration of racing a car. I know plenty of people who purchased the PSVR2 simply for this game alone. But if Sims are too realistic for you, let's jump into some action-adventure titles. And for both PCVR and Quest, I'm going to recommend the classic Vader Immortal title. I'm expecting to get a little pushback on this recommendation, but I found this to be the perfect combination of storytelling, cinematic moments, fun gameplay, and just an all-around great introduction to VR for any noobs out there. But the PlayStation VR2 definitely ups the ante in this category with Horizon Call of the Mountain. It doesn't matter if you're a fan of the flat game series or not, as this title gives you a whole new way to experience that world. Overall, it's absolutely stunning. They did an excellent job with the climbing and combat mechanics, and I loved every moment of this game from start to finish. I just wish it had a little bit better storyline or tied into the flat screen series a bit more. Now I also need to give an honorable mention to Hubris, which is available on all platforms. This game has a great combination of storytelling, fantastic graphics, plenty of action, and lots of different mechanics. No matter what platform you play this game on, there's definitely some wow moments, and overall it's extremely immersive. Now if you played this game when it originally released and found the combat lacking, I'm happy to let you know that it did receive some major updates. Now from here, let's move into one of VR's most popular genres, the social games. This category has not changed in years, and the biggest players remain Rec Room, VR Chat, and Horizon Worlds. Rec Room focuses more on user-generated content and mini-games, and it's definitely designed to appeal to a younger player base. Now, VR Chat puts the emphasis a bit more on socialization and includes additional features like full body and eye tracking. VR Chat also tends to function as a second virtual life. And finally, we have Meta's own Horizon Worlds, which is finally getting pretty decent. They're trying to populate it with everything imaginable, from mini-games to stand-up comedy or other live-action events. If you played it previously and thought it was absolute crap, well, you might want to give it another try. Now, unfortunately, if you're on the PlayStation VR2, there's no real social applications currently available, but there are plenty of survival titles available, and they're all extremely different from one another. The Quest title that surprised me the most was Medieval Dynasty: New Settlement. Just walking around, gathering materials, and building up your own shelter was extremely satisfying. The VR mechanics were done exceptionally well, and the game just feels like a series of achievements. The title also gives you a full campaign plus a sandbox mode. But if you're looking to crank things up a bit, Into the Radius is a serious survival title. It features this excellent immersive storytelling that's drip-fed to you throughout this creepy dystopian world you're in. This game can be brutally unforgiving as you're forced to scavenge throughout the world, and there's plenty of risk versus reward elements, or just some serious FU moments, like when your gun fails at the worst possible moment. Now for PlayStation VR2 owners, we're moving into the jungle with Song in the Smoke. So instead of dealing with the horrors of Into the Radius, you're just gonna have to deal with ferocious creatures. Luckily though, you could craft some weapons to help fight back, and you'll even be able to brew things like healing potions. So like I said, these survival titles vary greatly. But for our next genre, the tabletop game, the clear winner across the board is Demeo. Now this falls short of being something like Dungeons & Dragons or a true tabletop RPG, but it is, however, an excellent tabletop adventure game. You and up to 3 of your buddies get to select from multiple unique characters, all with their own special skills. You'll then need to make it through multiple separate dungeons and take down a truly epic boss. But if the tabletop experience doesn't get your adrenaline moving enough, let's jump over to some horror games. A brand new one is making its way onto this list for PCVR and PlayStation VR2, and that's Madison. This is primarily a psychological horror haunted house game, but not only does it have an interesting storyline, beautiful graphics, challenging puzzles, and some pretty epic jump scares. 10 out of 10 would get scared again. Now for Quest gamers, the usual answer is Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted, but I've actually never played through it, and instead I'm going to put The Exorcist Legion VR on the list. You'll be traveling to multiple different sites, each plagued by its own demonic creature, and hiding multiple secrets for you to find. And I pretty much guarantee this game will scare the crap out of you. Now, if you're looking to get your heart rate up without being scared to death, well, luckily VR has plenty of excellent workout games. For the Meta Quest, my personal favorite is Supernatural. It features a ton of popular licensed music, and it also features an array of personal trainers to help keep you motivated. Now, I had some excellent results using Supernatural for cardio, and one of my favorite aspects was the fact that it didn't feel like working out, and rather just like having some fun. The only downside to Supernatural is it requires a subscription service, so if that's not something you're interested in, I would definitely recommend Les Mills Body Combat. It's very similar in terms of the actual workouts, but the music and overall production value just isn't as good. It does, however, in my opinion, give you a better overall workout. And we've made it to today's final genre, the free-to-play games. Easily the most popular one out there is Gorilla Tag. This is a pretty wacky experience where you need to use your hands to push yourself off the ground, and it's not only quite tiring to move around like this, but it also takes plenty of time to master. Now there are a couple different gameplay modes, but mainly it's just a bunch of gorillas chasing each other. Now when you're done monkeying around, you can move on to shooters, and the first easy recommendation is Population 1. This is an extremely approachable battle royale title. It only takes a round or two to learn all the basics, and they've recently introduced a new Phoenix mode to keep the action fast-paced and prevent the game from getting too competitive. Additionally, there's a full sandbox mode where you could build your own worlds. Now, if you are looking for a shooter that's a bit more competitive, I absolutely recommend Hyperdash. It almost feels like an old-school arena shooter that also features modern gameplay modes and excellent mechanics made specifically for VR. Now, this is from the same studio that gives us the absolutely fantastic Breachers, and Hyperdash was actually their first big game, which they eventually made free-to-play. And that right there was today's list of the best VR games. Let me know what you agree with, disagree with, or if I missed anything down in the comments. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here, consider subscribing.